everyone, and welcome to Time to Head North. I'm your host, Natasha Ryan, former news anchor turned VP of Comms for the North Group. Delighted to have with me today our CEO, Stephen Hernandez, and TNG friend and probably one of the most intelligent humans on the planet, Dr. Treston Wheat. And I don't say that lightly, sir. I mean it. Real quick, before we dive in, I want to give a little bit of a background on Treston, and then I'll let you talk. You have so many titles, so be humble. Let me read them because I really want people to understand just what an expert you are when it comes to the field of intelligence in our industry. So currently, Treston is the intelligence research specialist for Insight Forward. He is a special advisor for Riley Risk. He's an adjunct professor at Georgetown and the editor-in-chief for International Protective Security Board. And of course, Steve is the CEO of the North Group, awarded combat veterans. So thank you both for being here today. And this is going to be a great episode. I am so excited for this. Treston, thank you so much for giving us your time this morning.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Did I miss anything?
No, just minor stuff, but that's just things I do on the side. So you listed the main things. That's what matters.
You did not say how amazing he is, and I think that's the issue.
So I just want to point out, when I go on social media, we see posts that involve intelligence and analysis, but you just have such a pinpointed brain for really getting next level thought provocation going, right? So when I read your material, it elevates my understanding of any topic. And I just want to say, I appreciate that from a colleague standpoint, all of the thought and time you put into educating people, because as we all know, knowledge is power, right? So I really enjoy your social media posts. I just wanted to say that before we got started.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so my newsletter, Geopolitics and Gin, that you're mostly referring to, I've come to truly love the edification aspect of this kind of position. And it really stems from getting to teach at Georgetown and teaching young people about the private intelligence industry and drawing heavily from what was historically a government thing, or at least in the 20th century, primarily government, and reinterpreting it anew for the 21st century.
Well, I love reading it, so thank you. I will confess, sometimes Treston uses words even I don't understand. So I might be calling you out to give definitions during this podcast.
It's entirely acceptable.
Okay, so in light of recent events and the time ahead of us in dealing with our presidential election, and of course Trump's recent conviction, I just kind of want to dive into this in a very generalist overview. If you had to kind of summarize, both of you, what is to come, right? I think, the verdict might have come as a surprise to some, not to others. So I just kind of want to jump in with a very generic kind of summary of, what is to come in this election year? What can we expect?
Yeah, Steve, would you like to start from the more physical security perspective?
Yeah, I think a conversation around this is important, right? I think that both public and private partnerships are working on this around the clock, especially with 2 conventions coming up, right? So I guess what's next, in my opinion, is I like to turn the lens towards what is our foreign adversaries going to do to attempt to undermine democracy. That's what keeps me up at night, right? Let's just lead with that. I think the next thing that I'm hyper focused on is how do we quell the emotions of party goers on either side, and then how do we make people still believe in the system for both sides? I think for me, the scary thing is there's so many disenfranchised people out there, and the media does a great job at fanning that flame to get bigger and bigger. So I think for us right now, it's just a matter of looking at, the folks that we're protecting and that we're contracted to protect, and figure out how that affects them, both second and third order effects. But I also think the other piece to it is identifying those adversaries on a much larger scale. I think national security has a lot of threats right now, and I think the election is just going to be at the forefront of that for the next 6 months.
Yeah, I would add to that a key analytic mistake, I think, when assessing these issues is presentism, which is another form of sort of anachronistic thinking, by thinking the present is somehow unique or different. And people got used to, for quite a bit of time, we'll say relative stability and moderation in American politics. This would really be 1980 to say 2008. We started seeing the decline in civility in a large way, the end of moderation during the second administration of Bush 43. But this really harkens back to much earlier periods in American history that I think people often gloss over and forget, from America's founding up through McCarthyism, and then in particular the 1960s, that this tension, the rank sentimentality about politics and the centrality of it to our lives isn't necessarily something new. But we do have to reinterpret the kinds of threats and risks that come with that sort of rising possibility of violence or foreign intervention. This wouldn't be the first time foreign intervention has happened, even in American elections. But we do have to reassess the particulars while keeping that sort of broader piece in mind, knowing that this isn't something new. And so we actually have a lot of historical data to draw from when analyzing and assessing this kind of stuff.
Well, and I think that, real quick, if I can, Tosh, just to go back to what had happened regarding, I think it was the 1968. Was it the 1968 Democratic Convention?
Yep.
There was a very real threat and a lot of protest activity that occurred during that time. And during that whole kind of generational change in what was going on with the Vietnam War and what have you, I think there was a national mobilization committee, if I remember, committee to end the Vietnam War, and they were called MOBI, and they started, I believe, in Grant Park, and it was really interesting because they had over 15,000 people gathered for that. And it grew into something that really, the mayor wasn't anticipating. And quite frankly, the mayor came out and basically incited the violence almost by becoming more combative and not using diplomacy and different things. And listen, you guys that know me know that I'm the first person to go away from diplomacy and go to just direct action, and we can figure it out the old way. However, I just know that the heart of what America stands for becomes at risk the moment we trade in civility, right? The heart of who we stand for. Here's the problem, though. I said this to somebody yesterday on a phone call. We're only 270 something years, 280 years old. There are nations that are thousands of years old, hundreds of years old, that have a lot more rooted discontent within as to the outside, that they oppose. So I think for us to sit here and try to understand motives and intent and what those nations are going to do to disrupt, I don't even think we fathom the journey that those nations are willing to go down to disrupt, right? The extent, which is where I'd love your opinion, because I think we could talk about, the sound bites that we're all hearing day to day, right? Between, these party politics. But for me, it's like, what are the real threats right now to election security and safety for both sides? Because I don't feel like there's candid conversations in our industry about that. We're all serving in one way or another, whether it's protective intelligence or physical security. But how do we keep delegates and folks safe at these events? How do we manage our security best practices to mitigate risk? And how do we deploy our assets? And what does that mean? Public-private partnerships. And then really, what does that mean towards foreign state actors that are intent on creating hate and discontent within the election cycle.
Yeah, I think that frames it exceptionally well, particularly when we start with foreign policy, something America isn't particularly good at because we were founded idealistically, as we tend to have a very idealized understanding of foreign policy, and we're not comfortable with the raison d'etat, sort of like the Richelieu line of thinking that is deeply entrenched in many parts of the world. Like the first great realpolitik text, Arthur Schuster, was written in India, even before Thucydides. So much of the world is much more comfortable with that sort of realpolitik action, even in intervention in elections. Because when the US historically has used propaganda, so this is mostly during the Cold War, it was just sort of sharing mostly white propaganda. That means something true, and we're just trying to get information out there. That was a big thing during the Cold War, was just share information in communist nations, or say like the Italian elections immediately after World War II. And so understanding the first paradigm of what are the national interests of people who might oppose, say, a more united United States, or one particular side to win or another to lose. So first starting with that kind of analysis. But then I think you hit at something else that's really important: ideological motivation for threat actors. Because contrary to some analysts, what they say about this, ideological motivation directly correlates to targeting and TTPs, that's tactics, techniques, and procedures. And so whether it's left-wing violence or say right-wing violence, they actually operate quite differently depending on their motivation and goals. And so by drilling in and understanding the particular threat actor's motivation, it actually opens up a lot of forecasting capabilities to assess what kind of person they would target, what kind of buildings they might target, or what kind of violence they might engage in. And so the sort of easiest example of this is the 2020 election, which we saw these mass protests throughout the country. That's typically left-wing violence. So left-wing violence either tends to be these like very, very large riotous protests when they occur, or they tend to be extremely targeted. Left-wing violent actors tend to want to particularly hit a singular person. Right-wing violence, on the other hand, tends to be, we would use the term thuggish. And so it tends to just sort of, in a particular protest, they'll engage in violence. The Proud Boys are quite infamous for this. So they try to go to protests, create a counter protest, and get people to start fighting so that then they can engage in the kind of violence they want to. So those are just easy examples. We could delve more into, say, left-wing versus right-wing terrorism groups from the 1960s forward. But like understanding the ideological motivation of threat actors, both in foreign policy sense and in more direct sense of a terrorist organization or protest group or extremist group, is extremely important when assessing the security of our principles.
So let's pause there for a second, because you bring up a really good point. Let's just step away from political security for a second and just talk about active shooter, active violence threats, right? Mm-hmm. Because I think, and it's funny because having the data points that we have access to on this, right? I've seen political affiliations, one of our main questions on the over 10 million data points that we've collected for a project we've been working on for a couple of years called SAFE. And one of the things that's really interesting is the political party alignment between the different threat actors, right? I think, 200 and something active shooters in the last however many years, right? There's a split between what they believed politically, and how that was motivated. The Nashville shooter was more personally motivated than politically, but had left-wing political ideologies. And I would say, was it Micah Johnson, Dallas, had a very skewed ideological base. One was based on racism, the other one was based on, what have you. And it's interesting because you bring up something that I think I am not concerned about the group. And I've said this to fellow law enforcement. I've said this to fellow security practitioners. I'm not concerned about the group. I'm concerned about the Timothy McVeigh. I'm concerned about the individual that's smart enough not to publish their manifesto. that has digital sanitation. I'm concerned about one of us. I'm concerned about somebody with best practice and knowledge in mind of how to operate autonomously and build resources and get enough tools and stage and plan and prepare. I think that we need to get away from, my opinion, we need to get away from the group talk, and we need to start getting back to that lone wolf actorship analysis, because I think that's where we're going to miss the boat. I think we're going to miss the next big vector because we've been group focused for 20 plus years now.
No, that is such an excellent point of, say, post 9/11, like terrorism analysis, heavily focused on Islamist groups. And so you see in the data this major decline in Islamist terrorist attacks. Why? Because we put in the significant amount of resources to track and target Islamist terrorist groups. And then we sort of went by the wayside on what are the lone wolf style attacks. And this is why, for example, ISIS began advocating for lone wolf style attacks in the West. And so rather than trying to replicate the failures of Al-Qaeda, because one of Al-Qaeda's failures was they would try to bring people to training camps and then send them back out. So this is like the underwear bomber and others. And that's how we could track and find them, is because when you cross borders, it's actually significantly easy to see where you're going, for example. Or when you're transferring funds, that's another thing, is you have to transfer funds for these kinds of operations. So by encouraging a lone wolf style attack, you can actually be significantly more effective in usually smaller scale. So I think another point related to this isn't so much that lone wolves aren't a threat. We have been relatively lucky, and I'm using that term specifically, lucky, that the Timothy McVeighs are actually quite rare. And so you sort of sticking with 90s terrorism, like a juxtaposition to this would be Eric Rudolph. Now, he was a relatively successful terrorist, but he killed very few people in comparison to Timothy McVeigh. Timothy McVeigh was just...
But what did he do? What did he do that was incredibly effective? Was fear.
Oh, yes. The hallmark of terrorism, of course.
Yes.
Oh, no, because I think one of the best examples of that is a great point. The DC shooter. Now, it turned out the DC shooter wasn't a terrorist. It was actually like a personal thing that he set up for terrorism. But you wanted fear. People were afraid to go get gas. People were like, they were putting tarps over like gas stations when the DC shooter was, DC sniper was like active. And so being able to create that kind of fear has extraordinarily negative consequences. And you're absolutely right on that. And so I think we have to rethink how would we track these sort of lone wolf actors now? Because you're right, not the vast majority. Some of them like aren't going to post manifestos beforehand, and they're not going to do the social media posts that make it easy for us to OSINT or kind of lead to them. So we have to think, how do we kind of track that? And this is where the onus is more likely on, say, government and law enforcement, who can get tips from friends and neighbors, because you always have indicators. People have always, documented after the fact. They're like, oh, I noticed this and I noticed this. They don't heed the DHS's statement of like, see something, say something. And we have from the literature is very important or clear on this, that the vast majority of terrorist attacks that are stopped are because friends, families, and neighbors reported the people before they could actually do something. And so how do we create those human networks? How do we create those pathways for the modern issue of like collecting the information to stop like those lone wolf attacks? But I very much agree with you that the worst ones that we face are those, and they are so much harder to track and analyze, especially in the private sector.
Well, and I think it takes it to a step further, right? Because we as humans are predictable, but as Americans, we're even more predictable, right? I think, what I would compare that to is if I'm a foreign state actor and I want to disrupt something, I just use the American machine against itself, right? That's why foreign lobbying power is such a threat, right? Because it's not even Americans lobbying our own judicial system; it's the foreign governments using, domestic lobbying powers to get foreign implications within U.S. sanctions and U.S. U.S. Congressional approval. I think that's incredibly dangerous, right? And I think to the effect of, if I want to influence someone, right? How do I create my narrative? I think it's all about narrative at the end of the day. And then how is my narrative? All warfare is by proxy now. And this is what I was saying to folks within some law enforcement agencies the other day. I was advising that I think what we need to do is we need to look at threat actors that are going to be motivated by a cause, but have indicators to be separatists and lone wolf actorship. And I think that because if I'll use the analogy, you brought them up earlier, Proud Boys. Let's say that I want to create hate and discontent at such an event, and I bring in a group that has built rapport with the Proud Boys, and they show up at that counter event, and they're dressed like the Proud Boys, they act like the Proud Boys, they talk like the Proud Boys, right? And vice versa. Let's say I do it for the opposite side. And let's say that the actual actor here is a foreign state actor, right? And we've already seen these type of exercises carried out domestically on U.S. soil. And we sure as heck know that we do them ourselves, right? So I think that's the concern to me. Now, the actual actor is just a byproduct of the creation of another nation end state or political party end state or whatever the string puller, the puppeteer is, right? The puppet master. But to your point, how do we track it? I think where it comes in is really, really good public-private partnerships. I think public-private partnerships are the key to this. I think this is one thing that previous administrations have looked at and done right by, because there's not enough federal agents and analysts in the federal government to tackle all of the threats that we now face, whether it's border security, whether it's national security, whether it's just state security, opportunistic crime. So what I would ask your opinion on is if I'm looking for, and because some of our listeners are security personnel, some of them are law enforcement, some of them are intelligence people. If I'm looking for a threat and I'm planning a major event, how does the great Dr. Treston Wheat go find that subject and advise the people that can to shut that threat down?
So
walk us through it.
Right. You have to start with your intelligence requirements. And I know that that's a tedious thing that most people don't like to do. But with OSINT, the way it is, you have to target your information specifically before you can even go to all the larger stuff. And so you need to sit down, like the way I usually describe this, say like in protective intel, is the analyst needs to really sit down with the EP agents and walk through like what they think concerns are, and then provide suggestions on questions. And you actually need a couple meetings on this. And again, I know it's tedious. I know EP agents don't like it. I know analysts don't like it, but like getting your intel requirements down, the actual key intelligence questions, the EEIs, essential elements of information for our military people, is get that stuff down first. That's going to lead you to start researching. And that's where the Google is honestly going to be like your biggest area, is just start going through the known reports. Then you start moving through social media and you see what people are commenting on these kinds of things. Twitter, Instagram, Threads, Gab, Truth Social now. Like you have to sort of go very, very wide on gathering all of that information. Okay. Then you have to start sifting. And so this is where we say, okay, this group is saying this group is saying this, individuals are talking about these things. You pull that information together and then do a deeper dive on those particular issues. And so this is the basic intelligence cycle in constant motion is the way you really have to approach this. And so then what's most apropos is the deep dives on either the groups or the persons of interest. and you start accumulating the relevant information to your intel requirements. And so one of the most well-received reports I wrote once was on May Day protests in Seattle. And so I went through like a history of May Day protests and anarchist protests, but then I put together basically profiles, and I did a whole thing on symbols. And so like these are the most common symbols that anarchists utilize. And so like if you think you can't really tell if someone, like if they have the kind of patch or something, I went through behavioral analysis and then hit on each of those things related to the groups. This was group focused rather than POIs, but dive into that. And so
let's pause right there, because I think this is where people are really going to get a great benefit out of I know your massive brain, and I know I can call you at any time, but listeners are going to be like, holy cow. So let's stay away from groups for a sec. Let's talk about the actor. Let's use a Super Bowl as an example.
Okay.
You've got a threat, an individual threat, and let's say that POI comes in by way of confidential tip, right? The worst kind of intelligence is the kind that we can't verify, right? It's not intelligence at that point. It's just information, right? We make it intelligence once we process it, right? So where do you go from there? Where does Dr. Wheat, you're in charge of this situation. What do you do next? That's all you have to go on. Talk people through how your brain works, because I think this is interesting.
Okay. First thing is the basic background check on someone. And so we're going to assume whatever protective intel team has Intellius or OnTick or the great platforms. You start with that. You break down everything you can find about the person. Social media life, employment history, family history, because that can be incredibly important as well. And you have to create those documents, the sort of network mapping. Again, I'm going to go back to a statement before. A lot of this can be very tedious work. So I just want to sort of lay that forward. It's like you can actually spend like 3 days just doing this part of this, which I've done. I remember one POI, I read 3,000 something tweets because like I wanted to like track everything he was thinking over the last like 3 years. So I literally read his entire Twitter thread. And so you have to collate all of that information. After you collate the information, you need to check against what we know as critical indicators of potential violence. So did he or she recently lose their job, divorce? Like those are sort of like the big ones. But then you also need to compare baseline to changes. This is a really important thing that analysts can miss, is you need an actual baseline. That's why you need to gather as much information about the person as possible so that you can say, okay, in 2022, their social media posts changed or they started moving more frequently. And so, the 5 years previously, they hadn't done any of those things. Okay, we have a major change. And then we track into that particular change to see, does this indicate a spiraling of depression? Or is this a change that like could indicate violence? And so you have to go through and break down the person's life and compare and contrast to critical behavioral indicators that are very well established. Like none of this is esoteric. It's we're well aware of the things that would indicate this.
So we're looking at motivators, means, capability, capacity.
Precisely.
What else?
So you said means, motive, capability, intent.
Capacity, intent.
Intent is actually a really important one because a lot of people can be extremists. Not all extremists are violent. And so you actually have to demonstrate like the intent that, I really want to cause harm or achieve a particular political objective or do something along those lines. Sorry.
Well, I've not, you bring up a good point with intent, because let's say we're not acting as the police right now. We're acting in a capacity of a private organization or private family. I never even from a counterterrorism standpoint cared about radicalization, I guess. I care about operational intent. And that was always the phrase that I was taught early on with CT, right? Which was, don't be concerned with radicalization. You'll work yourself into a hole and you'll never work out of it. Be concerned about the operational intent of that subject or subjects.
Yeah.
Are they able to carry it out?
Related to that, this comes from the work of Louise Richardson, a UK scholar on terrorism. But something you want to track with, say, like radicalized politics is complicit society. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean society at large. This is why we check into their families. This is why we check into their friends and connections. Are they around a group of people who would encourage them to continue on a violent path? Because, of course, legitimizing ideology, what we're referring to as radicalization, is going to be ever present. That's what I mean. Like, extremists abound. That's going to happen. But you need a
influence.
Yes, absolutely. And not just influence, but are they part of a community online or in real life that would accept the violence as legitimate? So that would they be entirely ostracized and hated or seen as bad if they committed violence? They're significantly less likely to. You need that complicit society, that complicit group. And that's why when you're diving into their lives, you want to see like, what kind of religious groups do they go to? What kind of clubs are they part of? Where do they spend their time and donate to? Because that can tell you, are they part of but do they operate in a group setting that would say it's okay for you to do these kind of violent actions? And then related to that, because this is where part of the earlier part of the conversation of like a lone wolf who doesn't post a manifesto or anything. Okay, like that's entirely plausible, but you are still going to see the indicators somewhere in their life from friends or family. And so in your scenario, you say this came in from a tip. This is where exactly what you're saying, public-private partnership is important. So like we get this tip as a private security group. We do the deep dive into the person, create the profile of who they are. We find everything we can through OSINTing, dark web, etc. We then match it to the relevant behavioral indicators, means, motive, capabilities, intent, groups, etc. And then we can pass this on to law enforcement, who then has access or capabilities that we necessarily can't. So we as a security group, for example, can't just go investigate out. To a certain extent we can, but we don't have the ability to necessarily go talk with all the family members and do the legal parts that law enforcement would be allowed to do. And so that's where like the public-private partnership would matter, if we can assess as an analyst or a security group that the evidence indicates the likelihood of violence.
Okay, I want to jump in here on public-private partnerships, because I'm thinking about how we continue to see and hear more depletion of employees on that level in the public partnership. And I'm listening to the amount of time dedicated to verify the information. Have you seen historically, civilian speaking here, have you seen historically the public partnership side more in tune with bringing on private partners? Are we seeing an increase in that? What does that look like?
I would say, yeah.
Yeah. No, the last 5 years, a little bit before that, but the last 5 years radically has changed government's approach, both or state, local and federal. I would argue it was really post Snowden. So Snowden does his thing, and then it's released that like tech companies, for example, had done all this work with the government. And so tech companies are like, oh, no, that was totally a mistake. We're not doing that anymore. And so they stepped back. And so, for example, the NSA realized they had to really very much change their approach to say like 0-day vulnerabilities or something like that. And so they started just sharing information with the private sector so that they could handle these kinds of things that they couldn't, because they're the ones intimately connected to the infrastructure, critical infrastructure, et cetera. And then we saw the real rise of OSINT. So OSINT has obviously existed time immemorial. I mean, Robert E. Lee used to read the New York Times every day during the Civil War to get information on the Union Army. So like OSINT is nothing new. but the ability to access it, the amount of tools that we have, the capabilities with OSINT, where people are actually having a discussion of should we create an OSINT intelligence agency at the federal government level, has radically altered this as well. And so Bellingcat, for example, this private group is now one of the leading intelligence groups in the world, and they're just private people like following the publicly available information. And so government came to realize, oh, we can actually get a lot more from the private sector than we used to. They have significantly greater standing and capabilities, and so we can actually start working together much more as equals than previously before.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion is yes. I think it's grown. I think here's the deal. It's going to get a lot more. The problem you have is action versus reaction. And then where I don't think we can go with public-private partnerships is direct action. I don't think private policing is a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
I think private security integrated within private policing and liaison functions is great, but I think what makes us America today is, I mean, the tremendous work that our full-time law enforcement does every day, the tremendous work that our intelligence community does every day, unsung heroes with the respective agencies. That I think the hardest thing is, you got folks that work an entire career and will never get credit for stopping some of the most heinous things in the world from affecting the American people. And right, wrong, or indifferent, I also believe that classification is real, and we should have classified programs. We should have classified subjects out there. There should be stuff that the American people are not read on. I just think that the American people can't understand why or what. But I think this is one thing that it's hard, because that classification goes to the public-private partnership, right? It goes to how much do we let the public within, the government and national security and stopping threats. The entire defense industry is run by corporations, right? I mean, the entire DoD is propped up by corporations, supporting them, right? It's not just the guys and gals. It's the beans, the bullets, the planes, the trains, the automobiles, the engines, the pencils, everything that's manufactured by a corporation to win, fight, and support that troop force is propped up through public-private partnerships, right? So I think what we're talking about is expanding that out towards a protective function of national security and the American people. Mm-hmm. I think we just have to be careful, but we have to be considerate. I could tell you, as a company, we've had success in the last year with it, and it's been kind of like on accident. Like, we didn't intend for the public-private partnership to happen the way that it did, but it did, and it worked really well. And found ourselves working with like-minded people that have a capability. Let me pivot and ask you another question here, just back to kind of the election security, because I think it's important to address this. So what are, in your mind, broad or individual threats towards the next 8 months dealing with the election, and what could go wrong? What are some 11 p.m. Dr. Wheat, I can't imagine what you do at 11 p.m. I just see you with you're petting a cat in front of a fire, reading a book in a velvet robe, man. I don't know, thinking about how to solve. Thinking about with a fine bottle of wine.
Yes.
So, but what does that look like, man? I mean, lay it on us, and then let's pick it apart.
Okay. So, I think the two biggest risks that we are going to face in this election are massive protests, akin to 2022. And I think that's going to happen starting later this summer. Not to be too sort of academic correlation, I think once it starts getting really, really hot, because we see a correlation between temperatures and protests and other stuff, And number two, I think we're going to see an assassination attempt on a candidate. And by that, I don't mean presidents, Trump and Biden, but this is work, I was doing for Insight Forward, where we were reassessing assassinations globally. And we see a significant rise in assassination attempts of political figures and political candidates. Even Mexico just had its election, and a mayor was assassinated right after the presidential election. I think you are going to see at least one attempt on a political candidate as well. And I think those are going to be the two biggest threats.
Well, there's only three of them, man. So what do you so, well, hold on. Let's come back to that. That's, feel like I'm talking to Tucker Carlson right now. This conversation, I'll tell you why a conversation scares me in a minute, but it does, because I know where you're going with it, right? Because a lot of us are thinking it. But let's talk about protests for a second.
Okay.
So timeline.
Mm-hmm.
So, I could say we've been involved in almost every protest for the last several years, one way or another. Whether it's protecting people, property, protective intelligence, what have you. What I can say is there is a very real, in my opinion, possibility that this becomes by proxy and is designed to get so out of hand that there's no putting the genie back in the bottle, if you will. What do you think?
I don't believe in a teleological approach to anything. So I reject the idea that events have to unfold in a specific way. I only believe in probabilistic.
Okay. You just had to tell me what teleological meant.
Yeah.
Because Dr. Wheat, once again, I think he's done. I'm at 43 words right now that I don't know. So it's fine. I'm writing them down because I'm Googling them. I will know that the next time we talk. Every time we talk, my vocabulary grows by 200 words. I'm just
guys, I'm going off camera for bandwidth purposes because I don't want to lose traction on the conversation.
So okay, so we're not fixed on one way, but let me ask you this: how bad can it get, Doc? What's the worst that could happen?
Worst case scenario, I think, is going to be massive violent protests at both conventions in different ways. So at the Republican convention in July, I think you are going to see major left-wing protests, particularly because of the Trump convictions, but also over reproductive rights, immigration issues. It's all going to sort of have this confluence at the convention. And we already seen Reuters just published an article this week on, say, the Proud Boys trying to be the unofficial protectors of the Trump campaign. And I think you're going to see major confrontation there. Now, this matters because Trump's sentencing is also going to be in July. And depending on the sentencing, say it's incredibly harsh, I think you're going to see fairly violent right-wing protests as well. And I think that's going to occur at both conventions. I don't think it's going to be just one. But I think it's going to be leftists going to the RNC and then rightists going to the DNC. That's going to create the kind of tensions. But I think also at the DNC, you're going to, again, you mentioned the 1968 election, which I think is apropos, because I think a lot of far left groups are actually very dissatisfied with the Biden administration and the Democrats as a whole. So, for example, Biden, as kind of a political move, just did his order at the border where they can shut down asylum seekers coming in. That's obviously an election.
Treston, the video cut out. You cut out right as you said. A lot of left people are not happy with Biden. So if you could just pick it up right there. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. So people are really not happy. Leftists aren't really happy with Biden because of his immigration orders. And they haven't seen him, or they don't see him as left-wing enough. And so I think you're going to see leftist protests at the DNC as well over the Biden administration not moving far enough left as they wanted to.
So one thing that I found to be really interesting recently, and we talked a little bit about this when we were grabbing beers together there in DC, but The genocide Joe thing that happened. I truly believe that's by proxy actors attempting to disenfranchise radical left extremists to have no solidified party involvement. And the reason is either for, I don't think it's for independent voting, right? I don't think it's for going after the independent because they really don't want him. I think it is terrifying enough. I think it's to disenfranchise a portion of the party just for hate and discontent and disinformation purposes. And I've talked to some of our colleagues within the IC about this. I truly believe that act, and because you haven't seen it too much, you saw it a couple times, and I think it was one actorship group heavily entrenched within the higher education protest activity that was going on.
Yep.
So what do you think about that? You think that there's a disenfranchised effort? There's an effort to go after the disenfranchised left or right to separate further and then just create more chaos?
Yes. And we have long evidence of this. Like this is not like a necessarily new thing. For example, we have evidence that came out a couple of years ago that Russia funded environmental groups quite heavily, so that they would turn against nuclear energy and create problems that would make Europe more reliant on Russian energy, Russian hydrocarbons. So like that's actually nothing new. If you're speaking sort of like a particular individual, I don't necessarily think there's like a puppeteer behind this, but we do see significant evidence that right-wing and left-wing groups, especially left-wing groups, are international in their orientation. Like they have the essential solidarity approach, so that left-wing groups on a particular issue will work with each other across continents. And in that sense, I wouldn't use the term disenfranchisement because I think we would use that differently. For me, that's about a voting procedure. But if you mean the sort of people who are becoming dissatisfied with society, dissatisfied with politics, absolutely. But I think there's something important to remember as we're assessing that, that the US political system as set up currently sort of encourages it. And this was an organic thing that happened in the 20th century that people weren't really prepared for. Sociologists, for example, had a hard time explaining it. But basically, Republicans started living next to Republicans and Democrats started living next to Democrats. And that's why we see like very specific sections of the country overwhelmingly red or overwhelmingly blue, is people who ideologically agree just started moving next to each other. And this helped catalyze a certain kind of extremism. And
okay, so let me go back to something though, because understanding how this works from a tradecraft standpoint, right?
Yeah.
You have a case officer or a knock, right? Somebody embedded within an organization. You have sources, you have, verified and trusted sources, and then, directions given. You mentioned the Russians, right? With, the 2016 oil and gas pipelines, which, was involved in that. And you look at that, they were 100% up at Standing Rock. They were 100% involved in, Keystone disruptions. Why? Right? I mean, so you got to go back, and I had a conversation with some of our folks the other day about this. You have to look at group actorship, motive, and intent. We go back to motive and intent. Look at that baseline, right? Why are they doing what they're doing? And then that will almost, if you can show that their motive and intent allows them to spend real dollars to prevent something. Obviously, the U.S. election, I think the idea, if I'm putting on my best, foreign threat actor hat here, is there's not really an end state other than disruption. So
yeah,
it's chaos. It's mass chaos. It's destabilization of the West. It's our inability to fund other problem sets globally, because we're so distracted with what's going on at home. I mean, is that a real concern that security practitioners and law enforcement folks, in your opinion, should be concerned about?
Absolutely. Oh my goodness, yes. Because like we're going to pull several strands of this together, and we'll focus on Russia for a minute because they're relatively easy in the disinfo space. Also, they're the best at it, which helps. Putin's disruption or Russia's intervention in, say, U.S. politics or Western politics writ large was sometimes about very specific issues. That's like the environmental groups. Is like they actually want people dependent on Russian oil. So like he wants to prevent Western governments from finding alternative areas. Okay. But then there's the direct ideological competition going on right now between Western governments, the sort of liberal democracy, and authoritarianism of its various kinds. And so Putin and Russia intervening in elections is absolutely just about disruption. Get people angry at each other, show the dysfunction of liberal democracy, and then hold up your ideology as something in return. So I think another example is when Russia put the LGBT movement on the list of terrorist organizations in Russia. This was obviously a political move to speak to certain right-wing movements in the West, but it was a bigger issue for places in like Africa, so that they could show solidarity with governments and cultures in Africa rather than Western governments. And so by just doing that, they create division in the West because you have more traditionalist members in the West, religious groups, and then of course like left-wing and humanistic groups who would support LGBT rights. And so you can create division that way. And so you could just get people arguing with each other and mad at each other, because we're going to get philosophical for a second. The hallmark of American democracy, one of the reasons of its tremendous success, was compromise. And this was Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, the Constitutional Convention, going up through the mid 20th century. Compromise was critical to American policymaking and democracy. And so you get rid of that, you have the basic standstill, and we have the data of this from Congress, where like past legislation has significantly gone down because like people can't compromise on anything. And so you hamstring the ability of the US government to promote its own interests and its own values just by making people more and more divided. And therefore their representatives refuse to work with each other.
Well, without compromise, wouldn't you have dictatorship?
Exactly. Exactly. Hence why it's so central to our understanding, because we rejected from the founding. This is something our founders were extraordinarily brilliant about, was the rejection of majoritarianism. That's what they really meant when they were, because our founders were critics of quote unquote democracy. And what they meant by that is they were critics of majoritarianism, and that 50% plus one get to decide everything for everyone. No. The premise of having state governments and then a bicameral legislature is all about the idea that you have to do the hard work of democracy. And the hard work of democracy isn't finding common ground. This is something people misunderstand about the concept of bipartisanship, is that's actually nonsensical historically. Rather, it's you get something, I get something in return. And then we compromise on it. And so we each get a little bit of something, and we can support the policies together.
So let me challenge a question, and we're totally going to go over here, but I don't really care.
We're good.
Let me challenge a question here. Do you think you're sitting in, after the Boston Tea Party, you're sitting there with the blokes racking up the largest unpaid bar tab in history, as I understand it. Do you think that then it was the way they wrote this, because they didn't plan for us to be so connected? They didn't plan for so many influence angles, as I'll call it, right? We had one influence angle back then, and it was human to human contact, maybe writings and teachings, newspaper, but are we just so connected now that, I mean, you've heard me say this, right? The greatest threat to humanity is disinformation, right? Decisions rise and fall unverified. And I struggle with, our enemies use our own system against us now.
The
right?
paradox of a free society. Absolutely.
The paradox of a free society. That's good. That's really good. Okay, going back to this. So you got protests.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that they are going to be directly ran by groups, or do you feel that, again, those threat actors, the boogeyman's coming for them as well?
I think the threat actors are going to be sparks. As we saw with quite a bit of the protests over the last 8 years, once they get started, they just kind of go.
What's the initiators? What's the initiators? What are we looking for as intelligence folks? What are we looking for? What initiators, identifiers are going to create the spark?
So rather than create say like a particular shooting or something along those lines, if I were having to monitor this for a group, I would create a list of the biggest possible sparks. So say law enforcement killing another minority, or the Trump conviction, so where he's getting sentenced. Like, create a full list of all those. I was using that for like left wing versus right wing sort of sparks, and then I would set up tracking for each of those issues. See which ones become salient online, particularly social media. And when they become salient, you will see that these are far, far more likely to become triggers than something else. And so when we're thinking of this, this is the kind of problem with, like, when we're talking about like sparks with protests, is because it could really be anything. It's just whatever becomes most relevant to those particular groups. That's why, again, if I were tracking this as like a part of a team, we would sit down, because I love whiteboards. Whiteboards are my life on this kind of stuff. And you write down all the things you think could spark like the protests. And then I would go back to like earlier conversation, create your intel requirements. So you would list them out, create your intel requirements, how you're going to gather and collate the information, and then you track them, each particular kind, to see what could lead to these issues. And I would probably focus, say, a month. Actually, probably I would start right now, because I think you're going to start seeing these protests in July. I think it's probably 60-ish% likely that they're going to start in July. So
okay, why July?
Because that's when like the real political campaigning starts.
Okay.
Because like we're still like, because you have to remember patterns of life. This is kind of like related to. So people are like, why aren't there massive protests in January? And by that I mean, like, January, where it's super cold in DC, etc. Because it's like incredibly cold and people are dealing with the holidays, and they're trying to get back to school for the semester, and et cetera, et cetera. Patterns of life matter. When are people most available to do like these kinds of protests and everything? Starting at end of June and going through sort of the middle of August.
Okay. That's interesting. So let's talk about the assassination side of things, because I just want to preface, right? Obviously, we are a politically agnostic organization that relies on our skill set to protect people, and we're not in a position to say that any of this is actually going to happen. What we're saying is based on the analysis, the intelligence that because I will agree with everything that this man says almost always, or I'll tell him that I do, just so he doesn't argue with me. But this is one of those things, I think, that's really important, that I think we're all a little afraid of this happening because of the second and third order effects. So give us your theory.
I think it is going to be a member of Congress, or someone running for Congress. That's most likely. And it's going to be the person who will be targeted is going to have said some sort of very controversial remark. And I know that sounds super general, but when we're thinking of, like, is it a member of the Republicans or Democrats? The people who are going to be like sort of lightning rods for this kind of stuff are going to be, I think, because I don't think it's going to be a presidential candidate. That tends to be significantly harder. And as we've seen globally, not just like in the U.S., post presidential politics might like lead to an assassination, but not necessarily like during the campaigning. But I think you'll either see sort of like an assassination attempt, or if you remember when the Republicans, there was the left-wing terrorists who targeted the Republicans playing baseball. Like I think you'll see an event kind of like that, where it's these controversial things have been said, and they represent a threat to whatever this particular lone wolf cares about, and they're going to go after them at either a campaign event or again something like the baseball game, where it's like people just sort of gathering, and it's like there's not going to be a lot of security or anyone really focused on stuff.
And just so folks that are not in the game here, that listen, how these are prevented is number one through protective intelligence, right? And very, very good tracking of POIs and historical threat information. The other thing is protective services. How people are protected will almost always dictate their availability to the threat, as I would call it, right? Because availability to the threat is going to be based on what that protection circle looks like, and then what that bubble for protective intelligence is over their entire ecosystem. Because if I can't get to you, second best thing is getting somebody you love. The other side of what Dr. Wheat is saying here, I think, is important, and tell me if you agree, Doc, is we have the largest height of mental health issues in the United States, the most connected time for disinformation to be relevant to a subject's ideological belief system, and more folks hell-bent on action regardless of side, based on belief. So cultivate all that. I see what you're saying. Your interpretation of this, though, is not a group or government effort as much as it is a lone wolf.
Yeah, I 100% think that, because the data from say like the last 5 years of assassinations really indicates that it's significantly more likely to be a lone wolf than it is to be a group, because again, our data on assassinations tends to be slightly personalized, so it's been filtered through a political framework, but then it becomes like it's a personal issue. That's why these people feel so motivated to go commit that kind of violence. Now, related to exactly what you were saying, is polling data from the last couple of years indicates an increase in the belief that violence can be necessary to protect democracy in the US, both left and right. It increased more on the right side, but we see a large minority in both left and right who now believe violence is acceptable to protect what they consider their way of life and our political system. And so I think it combines with exactly what you're saying, is we're seeing this confluence of various factors of constant. Humanity was never designed for constant information. I think you're right to have pointed that out. Like from a neurobiological and evolutionary standpoint, we were never designed to know everything happening in the world all at once. We cannot process all of that, and emotionally we can't process it, let alone intellectually. And then you combine that with extremism and the decline of social institutions. We now have, the data shows that like 1 out of 6 men have no friends. And we know that friendship, for example, is a critical variable in life expectancy, doing well in school. Yeah. You're raising your hand.
Oh, sorry. We weren't supposed to identify that we didn't have any friends.
Oh.
I'm just kidding, Doc.
I knew where that was going.
And so you're right that these confluence of factors make it significantly more likely. And that's also why I think it's going to be an individual rather than necessarily a group, because we go back to throughout the thing when we're talking about intent and motivation and ideology determining particular behaviors. A terrorist group, they may very well like an assassination, but to go to what you're saying about protective intel and protection of particular people, groups and individuals go for lowest hanging fruit, whatever has the fewest barriers to entry. And that's why I'm saying like a campaign event where like the candidate is required to go out amongst the population, or at some sort of social event where you're not thinking in security mindset. You're just thinking about, oh, I need to get a cocktail, or play the sports ball, or whatever it is. And so like with that decline in security mindset, that's what makes it easier for, say, a lone wolf person to come up with a small firearm, and be able to do an attack like that.
So I would agree. I want to talk a little bit about attack planning and vectors here. I'm really concerned about chem bio.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just be flat out. Like fentanyl scares the shit out of me. I am having conversations with people about mitigation strategies for mass disbursement, not just for political events, but for other major large scale events, and organizations that we're working with. I will say though, like the use of drones scares me. I think that there's so much noise out there. And to the point earlier, how do we track somebody that's not doing all the normal indicators of weapons acquisition? And I mean, we're not tracking, DJI buyers. They've got to register their drone. They've got to register a aviation system that, if modified, can fly a payload. Yeah. I mean, I would much rather just give people guns than give people drones, to be honest with you. Right? Just I feel like I can deal with the guy with or gal with the gun much easier than I could deal with the subject with a weaponized, UAV system. Yeah.
And the war in Ukraine has shown that this is another area of very low barrier to entry, where you can use extremely cheap drones, modify them as needed, and then utilize them. But this is where I think the security industry, no, but the security industry needs to learn from this. And what I would say to them is, and this is, something like we've talked about before, like at conferences, like the physical cyber convergence, is although we've talked about this for years, and by we, I mean the security industry, not just you and I, but like, I still don't think modern security groups are great at applying emerging technology in order to achieve their aims. So for example, you're talking about drones. How many of your EP teams have drones that they regularly use for surveillance of protest groups or surveillance of their principal? Or how many of them carry them in their vehicles ready to easily deploy? How much is machine learning utilized in your intelligence gathering and analysis? The security groups need to take in these new threats along with the new ways to actually try to counter them. Because say, for example, you had a POI who doesn't have the normal indicators online. And so okay, we just have this particular or this unspecified threat. We think this is a person. Then that's when we move to creating the right concentric circles around the principal. And that can incorporate things like drones or data analytics of the particular events they're going to. And the hard work of doing EP, people going ahead, mapping out the area, your protective intel people, mapping out hospitals and planes and all the necessary stuff that goes with travel security. And so we in the security industry have to be far more comfortable with the quote unquote emerging technology, which is not really emerging anymore, it's here. Be far more comfortable with it to apply it to counter the very things that I think you're talking about.
Yeah, you bring up a lot. Well, I think what we'll do is we'll continue this conversation over the next month, 2 months. I think because, and I'm going to definitely be tapping you. I love your perspective on things. You're so plugged in. I consider you a dear friend, a thought leader, confidant. So really appreciate it. I would agree with everything you said. I would say that we are in for some interesting times, and it's a great time to be in the security business. That's for sure.
Yes, it is.
I want to add, I think one interesting topic I would like to dive into this in another conversation is, we typically talk about the media and, transparency. Everyone knows I'm a former news person. We talk about the media, quote unquote, fanning the flame. And as I sit here and think about the expectations, right? Because I typically compare like journalist with intel analyst. You have information, you have to verify it, you have to have a trusted source, right? What should the expectation of a media person be in today's standards? And do we need to rethink how we're reporting the news? Because a news reporter does not have adequate time to verify information, especially when you add in things like AI, misinformation. I mean, this job just got exponentially harder, not only for intel analysts, but also for journalists that have a very limited amount of time and a deadline to adhere to keep their jobs. So I love that's it.
Yeah, you're pulling a string on a topic that ultimately goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is the ability to verify. Listen, I believe AI is a major tool set here. I believe AI weaponized to verify because it's you're just looking for validation.
Yeah.
You're looking for confirmation of accuracy. I think somebody needs to create a disinformation counter disinformation tool that is solely weaponized for that. And built to counter, because at the end of the day, and Doc, tell me what you think here in a sec, but I think you're right, Tosh. But how much of that is opinion versus verified news as well? I think that's the other journalism mistake.
Oh, I agree with you, because so like you have the verification issue, and this might be a controversial statement, but I think crowdsourcing verification is actually going to be a critical part of this in the future. We've already seen that as one of the most effective tools of, just give like Redditors time, and they'll find like or verify like the stuff they need to. But to what you were saying, Steve, of opinion versus facts. And so I think we bifurcate or separate the verification needed of like immediate information. And I think journalists can easily just say, we're trying to verify the information as it's coming in. There's a protest or a terrorist attack or a conflict outbreak or something along those lines. Okay, we're feeding the information we're getting. We haven't fully verified it. And I think that should be part of like the statement of like, we're actively working on the verification. That's different from, and I think this is what Steve is pointing to, choosing which topics to report on, and then holding those up as being more important than they actually are. So one of my biggest criticisms of journalists and media today is there are things going on all over the world. How much of that are they actually reporting on? Now, they will, of course, retort they have to do what sells newspapers or subscriptions online now. And I would say, okay, these are not boring topics. If people are bored reading about these various topics, that's more on you and bad storytelling. Because we have things going on in Sudan and Ethiopia and Somalia and DRC and Argentina, Mexico, everything. There's so much going on in the world that you can report on that really matters. And instead, you're choosing to report on campaigns in the US.
You bring up such a good point. There's entire villages being wiped out in Sudan right now.
Yes.
I mean one of the largest genocides we've seen in Africa in years. And no one's talking about it.
No, a new think tank report has come out, and about 2.5 million Sudanese are likely to die by the end of the year. And how many times are people reporting on this? They're not. And so I agree with you, Tosh, like the immediate verification is extremely difficult. And I think just acknowledging that would go like a long way, because intel analysts have the same problem. We've all done sit reps. I've sent out sit reps I've had to correct before, because it's like, oh, this thing just happened. Here's what social media or news people are saying. I will update you in an hour. And it's like, okay, all of that was wrong. like the choosing of which topics to focus on, and then how, because this is where frameworks of analysis are incredibly important. How are you interpreting that data? There's like the common, we can go back like 40 years, or sorry, like 30, sorry, to George H.W. Bush. And like this is taught in journalism schools, and the famous of like Bush apparently not knowing how to use like the food checkout thing. And that was really, he was asking how like the new model differed from the old one, but journalists reported it as he was so rich and out of touch, he didn't know how to use how the scanners worked for buying groceries. That's the kind of thing that journalists, and I would argue, and again, this is probably controversial, I think most journalism schools are failing to teach how to do this well. That we have allowed activism to define journalism rather than the investigative analytic mindset. And this is really about mindset.
Yeah, let's call it gaslighting for journalists, right? I mean, right? I mean, they know their intent on their statement when they say, but listen, I don't want to.
Yes and no. Yes and no. Okay.
No. Well, let me say this.
Assignment editors, producers. I mean, there's such a chain of command, and there has to be an appetite for, there has to be an appetite for Sudan, right? People have to. I do agree. People have to want to hear that news to make an argument to report on it, right?
But corporations have bought the media outlets and are dictating what they report on based on what their political agendas are. And we know that, right? We know that true journalism is not at the forefront of the major news outlets anymore. And we know that there's not a major plan to give people the things they need to hear, both based in fact and fiction. You can take the same photo, depending on the photo, turn it upside down and show a completely different story. And that is the narrative, right? It's how do I build that narrative? I would say you need to dig deep to understand this, Natasha. You have to dig deep into both media outlet ownership, lobbying, and involvement, board involvement within that outlet. And I mean, the political outlets, they're tailoring to their viewers. What scares me more is the folks that are manipulated in media, right? Manipulated to spread something that's now going to millions of people, unverified, unvetted. I think that's the concern. I think we should do a conversation on mass disinformation and propaganda operations. We should highlight where they started and go back, right? I've got some really good historical examples of that. I think that's what we should talk about next.
Yes, let's table this. I want to bring a media person on, and of course, I have my own perspective and examples. So I love this conversation. Thank you both for your time. This is to be continued. And if you'd like to hear more podcast episodes, you can do that by going to tngdefense.com, or if you just want to hear it, you can do that on Podbean, Spotify, or iTunes. Again, thank you so much for listening, watching us today, and thank you to Steve and Treston for coming on. Until next time, everyone, have a great day.